This is Let Me Sum Up, your annual deep dive on the outcomes emerging from the UNFCCC Conference of Parties. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on Wurundjeri Land, and I'm joined by my two co-hosts. Global Vice President for Marketing and Extortion at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening, Luke and Tennant. I'm delighted to be joining you from Gadigal country, and I will note for the record that I'm wearing an LMSU t-shirt.
Oh my
God. And for those eagle-eyed observers who were watching some of our videos that we were posting at COP, you might have noticed that all three of us were wearing LMSU t-shirts. Can I just take this very brief moment, because this might be the only triumphant thing we discuss this evening, to mark those marketing and extortion KPIs have been met.
When can our listeners expect to lay down some of their hard-earned, Frankie, for these very special t-shirts?
Stay tuned for further updates on that. I couldn't make it that easy for everyone, could we? We just got to dangle it out there. Build up the FOMO.
Treat 'em mean, keep 'em keen is the Muscovich moral
apparently
to the story. All right, well, I'm going to move on lest we segue into a 25-minute sidebar on T-shirt production.
Unprecedented.
So I'll introduce a man who stayed up late for the COP29 closing plenary in the wee small hours of Sunday morning and set the alarm so he could share his up-to-the-minute, on-the-ground reports with the listeners of this podcast. Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant, and thank you for your service.
I've had something like 3.5, maybe 4 hours of sleep following the 24-hour COP-a-thon, and I think I claimed last night that I would be tanned, ready, and rested for this podcast. That may have been an exaggeration. But I am conscious, and that will do.
That was the sleep deprivation talking, I think we can say.
Crazy brave.
As I just reminded you, this was your idea. So we'll forge ahead, and I hope we can get through it as painlessly as possible. This week's episode is all about the highs and lows of COP29. Important to note, Frankie and I flew back to Australia at the conclusion of week one. So while we have been tuning into plenaries online and skimming negotiating texts, we're going to be relying on Tennant for a lot of the colour and movement from the ground. Tennant, this was, of course, the Finance COP. And as has been covered in detail over the last couple of episodes of this podcast, we went into the COP with a big divide between developed and developing nations. When we checked in at the halfway mark, that divide was very much still in place. We're going to get to the outcome of where we landed in the closing plenary that just wrapped up a few hours ago. But can you give us a bit of a sense about how the week went and the various ins and outs of negotiating texts that were circulating at different points over the last week or so?
Yeah, so the finance discussions were indeed at the heart of everything, and they were, unfortunately for colour and movement, heavily behind closed doors in this second week. There were a lot of ministerial consultations facilitated by Australia's own Chris Bowen during the first half of the second week. There were then a lot of presidency consultations and back and forth, which were also behind closed doors. And so there was more than usually a lot of people walking around asking each other if they knew what was going on, a lot of seeing whether any scraps would be out. It wasn't until just a couple of days before the conclusion that the number of 250 billion even firmed up as the initial offer from 250 billion US dollars per year by 2035, firmed up as the initial offer from the developed countries. And so you had to sort of take it on faith that stuff was happening. But then if you buttonholed battle-weary Australian negotiator or some such, they would tend to say things like, "Oh well, we think it's going to happen, but it's a 50.1% chance," or that, and then the inexperience of the presidency is showing through. And so, yeah, there were divides at the start, divides on the way through, and then there was a bit of a divide at the end.
Well, I've been sort of hoovering up the reports that are available around the last 24 hours, and it sounds like there was a draft text finally circulated last night. Tennant?
Yeah, you could walk around and see, like, Jennifer Morgan, the special representative on climate for the German government, or a luminary of US climate negotiations who seems to only emerge from her underground fortress at the moment of final deal doing, just poring over texts on their phone at a time when there were no officially available texts at all to be looking at. All the parties seemed to have seen it, but nobody in observer land saw a text yesterday until like half an hour before it was adopted.
Right. So the reporting I've been reading from Climate Home News suggests that the $300 billion a year by 2035 goal, which was ultimately adopted, emerged in copies of a new finance text that was circulated on Saturday evening to parties, and that a bunch of developing countries, notably the LDCs and the SIDS, were pretty unimpressed. And then, in fact, there was a counter offer of a demand of $500 billion annually by 2030. Did you hear anything about that while you were wandering around, sort of buttonholing negotiators?
We heard the $300 billion number, and that was by, that was in circulation by like 1 p.m. Baku time on the Saturday, noting that we finally closed out proceedings, like the absolute bitterest of bitter ends, around 4:30, probably 5 a.m. on Sunday. So things went a while. So the 300 had been moved to. That was the number by the early afternoon. But that text, like, I think there was a number, and then the elaborated text that included that number may have taken a bit longer to go about. There's a question with all these numbers of, like, how much do parties believe that they are mobilisable? Like, if you just say a number and get somebody to agree a number, can they actually deliver the number? Yeah, and I don't know the extent to which people believe that.
So the $300 billion per year by 2035, which isn't even, as someone on our WhatsApp chat pointed out, a commitment to that figure every year until then, just that you have to hit $300 billion per year by 2035, isn't the only figure in this text. That's the one that everyone was hanging out to see. But in the item above that, it also calls on everyone to enable scaling up of finance to developing countries from all public and private sources of at least $1.3 trillion per year by 2035. The interesting thing, though, about that versus the 300 billion figure that immediately follows it also includes, it also kind of encompasses finance that could flow from a variety of sources: public, private, bilateral, multilateral. It's probably worth unpacking the technical differences between those numbers. Like, presumably the 1.3 trillion also accounts for domestic flows of finance, I guess, and maybe flows of finance, between like the global south to the global south. Like, a lot of the way that the NCQG has been framed up is like very much a developed to developing, global north to global south. It's just a little, I think this would be quite confusing to your average punter to read that and understand like what the difference between those things is.
Well, Frankie, God help any average punter that is reading any of these documents.
Well, so you're totally right. It is a complex document in a massively complex context, but also a bunch of people without a huge amount of context to it, like, are reading it and are reacting to it. There were, I don't want to cast aspersions, but there were a lot of people in observer land in the plenary meeting who had immediate and extremely strong opinions about the basically the inadequacy of the finance text, who I think were, many of them, not all, largely going off 300 is a much smaller number than 1.3 trillion. And like, that was it. The nuance is quite important. Not to say that I've got all the nuance in what remains of my head, but it is such an important document that people will read it and read things into it, whether they have a context to assess it or not.
I wondered whether the prominent reference to the 1.3 trillion goal, which kind of reflects the scale of finance that was identified in Dubai last year to support developing nations to respond to climate change. It almost serves a similar function to, the aspiration to keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees did in the Paris Agreement. And so this is a number that has taken on a huge amount of significance for a certain subset of parties. It's incredibly important for it to be in there somewhere. Getting it in there is a basis for further work. And indeed, there is further work that is flagged in this document, right?
Sure is.
So they have inaugurated the Baku to Belém roadmap for 1.3 trillion, which...
The B2B.
The B2B. It's not necessarily the acronym they were going for in terms of what it's redolent of for some stakeholders.
Let's put a pin in that, because there's an even worse acronym associated with the events of last night.
A 12-month work program, as I read it, co-facilitated by the presidents of COP29 and COP30 to report at COP30 on this broad aspiration of how we can scale up finance to 1.3 trillion. I guess that keeps the conversation going and gives parties the opportunity to go, well, heading into COP29, $100 billion was the floor. Heading into COP30, $300 billion is the floor. And then, where can we push it to from there if you are of the view that, that is an inadequate aspiration. One other area of failure, which disappointed some parties, was the failure to unpack the degree to which the $300 billion that was committed to would be made up of grants,
yes,
versus other types of concessional finance or the like, which was one of the huge issues, right, going into COP29, and it remains unresolved. We've been arguing about it for about 15 years, and it seems like we're going to continue arguing about it possibly for another 15 years.
I mean, the fact that it didn't appear that there was anything close to an emerging consensus on that in the lead into these talks, as well as even just observing, and I was following the NCQG track during the first week of COP, like, they were so constrained by what even the contact group was able to negotiate. The 9-page framework was thrown out by the G77 plus China on like the first or second day, back to 35 pages of, duplicated text. Like, it just, to me, it seemed really unlikely that they were going to be able to resolve some of those things if there wasn't an indication of some consensus going into these talks.
One of the extra things that didn't make it in was any real carve-out or specificity of aspiration around the amount of finance flowing, and particularly concessional finance, flowing to least developed countries and small island developing states. And that was an interesting one because on some of these other finance issues, it was very much a developed versus developing cleavage. But on this one, it was a fracture within the developing country bloc that was at issue. There was, in the closing plenary, a statement made by Australia on behalf of the umbrella group of nations, really profoundly regretting the lack of consensus on a special appropriation level of support for SIDS and LDCs. And it was some other developing country groups, I think including the African group of nations, who were very uncomfortable with that apportionment because it's a fight among developing countries for a share of the help that is available. So in the end, there's a couple of mentions in the text of the special needs of LDCs and SIDS, and they do indeed have plenty of special needs, but there's nothing in the nature of, a 10% or a 30% or whatever the figure might be of the up to 300 billion that is reserved for them. As difficult to implement as a percentage would have been, I think that there was a very strong sense from many, but not enough parties, that some flaw under the help for those nations was needed, and it hasn't been achieved this time.
Can I ask you both a question? So the contact group that had been leading the sort of, technical but like negotiations on NCQG for the last couple of years, I think it was co-chaired by, obviously Australia, and then I think it was Egypt.
I think that's right.
Because this document commits to this Baku to Belém roadmap with effectively Azerbaijan and Brazil kind of leading this, I'm sort of interested in how you think that might evolve, given there were several group parties and groups of parties at the end in the final plenary that expressed pretty severe discontent with the process. I think we should...
About as severe as it gets.
I think we should talk about that briefly, and because I wonder if it has implications for how this rolls from here on out. Presumably, if you're wanting to get some groupings back on board, they would need to feel, perhaps a sense of a stronger sense of ownership or inclusion in the process moving forward. Can we just quickly step through actually what happened? Because this is the finance COP. There was a part 1 plenary tenet where some of the more straightforward things were adopted. Did that include the Article 6 stuff as well?
It did, a little surprisingly. We'll come back to Article 6, the carbon markets and other forms of international cooperation. But, that got gavelled through to big applause in the non-contro section that didn't start until 9-something in Saturday night. And then we had a pause while we waited for other things to be done.
Yeah, so some hours passed. Clearly there was a whole bunch of last-minute negotiation and horse trading around this. And then
some just document preparation, just literally loading things into the UN system that took about half an hour.
Yep. So that all happens. They come back. They approve a work program on gender equality measures, which got a round of applause. Maybe we can revisit that later. And then they go straight to finance. And the president basically gavels this thing through with, very pleased to present, new quantified collective goal in finance, bang. And then India sort of wants to make an intervention. And my God, that's probably one of the most powerful interventions I've seen from a party in a plenary session like that. It was quite remarkable.
It was a scorching barn burner.
It really was. And the thrust of it was that obviously so disappointed in the process and the result that they refused to endorse or agree with the item that had just been gavelled, made an assertion that they had been promised an opportunity to speak before it was gavelled through. Whether that's true or not, that's what they said. And then really laid it on like this is nothing but an optical illusion. How dare you railroad us into this result? And then, the India delegation was backed up by several other parties that spoke. That was pretty pretty shocking. Even if you're familiar with these processes that are used to a bit of staged, managed interventions like that after the fact, would you both observe a bit of the politics of that and what was going on there?
It was striking. I think the thing that was most striking about it was when she said, therefore we oppose the adoption of this document, immediately after it was gavelled through in what is supposed to be a consensus process, and after she made the claim on behalf of a very significant developing country that she requested to speak before the document was gavelled through, and that request was denied, which, I don't have any insight into the theatrics of this, to the degree to which this was stage managed to get an outcome. I can only take what has been said on its face, and what has been said on its face, you've got to read as undermining the consensus-based process, and that's how many, many people will take it. And the thing that I'm concerned about, because we've had different instances of this over the last few years, where developing countries, call out the process on the way through. This, I agree, Frank, is the starkest in my memory, is that it undermines the legitimacy of the process, and the cumulative impact over time allows parties to maybe get an outcome while, expressing their displeasure that all of their demands haven't been met. This is a really, really important process. Indeed, it's the only process we've got for dealing with some of these issues, and if it's constantly delegitimised in this way, that could have really significant implications over time. So yes, it was pretty striking, and as you say, a number of other parties, really backed in India's position. Bolivia always gives good plenary. Did so again.
I really do. I was so bummed that he was speaking in Spanish, and my Spanish is passable, but I'm very rusty and I didn't have the translation live headphones that Janet might have had access to. But then Nigeria...
The battery was out in mine.
Oh, bugger. Okay. It was just an atmospheric...
I could pick out references to neocolonialism and other classic Bolivian themes.
Yep, that definitely featured. And then you had Malawi speaking on behalf of LDCs, I think, off the back of it, potentially backing in what India, Bolivia and Nigeria had said.
I just want to be clear. I'm not criticising the developing countries for making these statements, which certainly came across as heartfelt and coming from just a deep, profound anger with what had been arrived at, what they saw as a miscarriage of process. I'm just expressing concern for the integrity of the institution that these sorts of events potentially impact.
And to that, the India's intervention criticised not just the presidency, but the Secretariat, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat. She didn't name Simon Steele as the Executive Secretary, but yes, she was voicing criticism for the whole edifice, and very strongly.
So we should talk about the connection of this item to the mitigation work program and the UAE dialogues, because, I think for keener observers on COPs, it appears that those two things and the sort of relevant outcomes may be connected in terms of the interventions that we just spoke about being privately they knew that was going to happen, and this was their chance to express their views on how this was going to go. Yeah. And in exchange for that, or alongside that, you also had the EU pipe up and, supporting the NCQG that had been arrived at, said that it had been a hard, challenging process, but, were happy with the result. And then said, when it got to the time to talk about the UAE dialogues and the mitigation work program, they couldn't accept the text as it was drafted. And I think the reason for that in the end is that in their view and multiple other parties which are really sort of aligning with developed countries, more sort of ambitious groupings, didn't think it went further or built on the outcome of the GST, the global stocktake from last year in Dubai.
And specifically tripling renewable capacity, doubling the rate of energy efficiency improvement, and
transitioning away from fossil fuels.
The structure and the optics of these documents matter, right? Because whilst technically there's an item that recalled or, adopted the previous year's outcome, what the text didn't do was clearly enunciate those things to reiterate a commitment to that energy transition, the tripling up, the doubling down, the phasing out of fossil fuels. However, what it did do was include an item saying that there was a role for transitionary fuels.
What can those be, Frankie?
I think in support of energy security. So, there was a deliberate choice to not emphasise, the things that those more ambitious countries would have wanted to see reinforced and built upon, and so this would have been viewed as a bit of a backslide on last year. And so you had the EU, a number of other parties. I think Australia spoke for the umbrella group on this as well, right?
Yes, but not just developed country parties. Also Chile for ILAC, Maldives for AOSIS, and Fiji in its national capacity. A bunch of high income and low income but high ambition countries said that unfortunately where the GST dialogue text had got to was not something they could support. And so the countries that wanted high ambition had to block the adoption of the ambition piece of the outcome. And in this process, finance and mitigation ambition have always only really been able to move forward when they go forward together. Sometimes with a little, here's an IOU and we'll sort out your bit of it further in the next COP or the one after that. and we hit a snag in that coupling this COP. The extra mile of mitigation ambition wasn't there. Therefore, the extra mile of finance wasn't there, or vice versa. You know, you can't really say which one comes first. Saudi Arabia was reported to have been, you know, handwriting edits into the GST text. But, you know, that would have been, I was not in the room where that happened, the result of the position of the like-minded developing countries bloc with which Saudi Arabia works very closely, or the Arab group of nations, ditto, and in part a response to, in part a causa of, the inability to go beyond 300 billion in the finance bit. So it's like it's all dysfunctionally connected.
The thing that concerns me about this part of the negotiation outcomes is, like, we've ended up with a very muddy outcome as countries head into 2025.
Yes.
To announce their next round of nationally determined contributions. So there hasn't been a clarion call coming out of this COP, you know, encouraging countries to really ramp up their ambition. You've got the global context around the election of a second Trump administration, which is further muddying those signals. We did get a couple of, as we discussed on our last episode, NDCs from significant countries, both the UK and Brazil, announced what were regarded and widely reported as quite ambitious NDCs. So it wasn't all one-way travel, but it's hard to make an argument coming out of this COP that we, you know, got the wind at our backs and, you know, we can look forward to a whole bunch of ambition in 2025. You know, there's a lot of local context which will necessarily drive decision-making country by country, but the international context isn't necessarily proving that helpful for ambition, I think.
I would add one thing to that, and I guess it's hard to see it as a clarion call, but there is in the finance text, the new collective quantified goal text, a reiteration of all the outcomes of the global stocktake last year. So that bit of text, which was a piece of the GST dialogue text that failed, was also inserted into the finance text. And it literally just says, we reiterate the outcomes of the GST. So you have to go and do some exegesis on what those outcomes were. But if you want to say, this COP repeated the strong call from the global stocktake for 1.5 aligned NDCs and for the triple-double and for the phase-out, that is literally true, even though it's all kind of buried in a footnote effectively.
So classic Tom Cruise character, Jerry Maguire, famously shouted, "Show me the money." Australian Green List luminary Frankie Muscovich has been known to shout at cops, "Show me the buildings." Frankie, was your call heated at COP29?
Got me some buildings action. Yeah, I did.
Oh, the buildings had you at hello.
Yeah, they did. I thought you'd never ask. I had this wonderful opportunity to talk to Australia's lead negotiator in the mitigation work program, and because I think this is just a general shout out to the Australian delegation, the people who worked for quite a while in the lead up to COPs to set up pavilions, to obviously around the world negotiating at a series of meetings that happened in the lead up to COP through the year. Australian stakeholders are given the opportunity to attend briefings through the year on progress on all these things. And I just think that's kind of amazing. And I'm not sure that other countries do the same level of engagement. So that is just a really neat thing and greatly appreciated. Earlier in the year, I was aware that there were going to be talks on the roles of cities, urban systems and buildings through the year as a part of the mitigation work program. And so for the first time ever, there was the prospect that the final text in the COP this year would talk about the findings and opportunities and barriers focused on buildings and urban systems. And it was sort of there in black and white finally in the mitigation work program text. And whilst, you know, the things that are in there talks about the importance of designing building envelopes for energy efficiency, retrofitting in new construction, reducing embodied emissions, spatial planning and low carbon infrastructure, electrification and switching to clean and low emissions technologies. All of this, like, you know, it's like a no-brainer to anyone who works in this space, but it's significant to the extent that it's the first time that that work on the built environment's been referenced explicitly like this in text and COP. And to me, that's a promising sign that whilst obviously COPs are usually always going to and have focused more on the high-level ambition piece, but, you know, we're getting to the pointy end of some of the discussions as we are in nation states about the fact that you do need to decarbonise well and truly across the entire economy, right? This isn't just an energy system issue. We need solutions for buildings, we need solutions for transport, solutions for agriculture. And so to me, it's really pleasing to see that focuses on other sectors are starting to come through this work. And I think, you know, the mitigation and implementation work program is where we're going to start to see more of that. So yes, very chuffed. And also just sort of expressing appreciation to getting some insight through the year on how that was all tracking.
Frankie, you can lord it over some other sectors who missed out.
Well, I might just.
An effort to get a call for global goals on transmission and on energy storage in the not agreed GST dialogue text, and that didn't even make it into the final draft that didn't get agreed. So buildings beat transmission is not always the outcome in debates in Australia.
The cherry on my building cake at this COP was to find out that the IPCC is doing a special report on cities that will come out in 2026, which is the year that Australia could be hosting COP. So as far as I can see, it's buildings all the way out from here, baby.
Everything's coming up Muscovich.
Well, it's about bloody time on the building side, not on the me side, but, you know.
No, this is all about you, Frankie.
Buildings need their time in the sun. Buildings are too often invisible. I walk into them all the time. Speaking of the bid...
I approve the buildings word count in this podcast. I think we can move on.
Speaking of Australia's bid, the outcome is not determined. That was one of the other things that didn't get sorted. Nope. Turkey is not taking a step back.
Yes.
They vigorously asserted their desire to host the COP. They were still asserting it in the closing plenary.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah, that when Turkey made that, like, it was very late in the piece. It was in the piece where everybody's doing gracious thank yous to the presidency they've just finished bucketing. And they said they look forward to hosting. They'd said not only that they were still hosting, but that they expected everyone to vote for them.
How dare they?
Which in translation may not have sounded as good as they intended it to sound in Turkish.
Mm-mm.
So there is a decision, and the decision is that this matter needs to be sorted out by the June session, the intersessional or between COPs meeting. And it may be that Turkey is hoping They have not voiced any demands for what they would like in order to withdraw. They're just saying we sincerely want to host the COP and we're bloody gonna. They may be hoping that Australia has a change of heart after our forthcoming election and that they have a clear field after that. I would not think that would be a safe assumption, not just because of, political arguments about what's the odds of a change of government or whatever, but because hosting a COP would be just so in Australia's interests that actually either potential next government ought to be quite enthusiastic about showcasing our resources and agriculture and clean energy and clean metals and all the other current and future economic opportunities that we have to the world is just like you can't buy that kind of exposure. You have to earn it.
I agree. I think there's every prospect that a Dutton government would forge ahead. Not guaranteed.
Isn't the fact that they haven't ruled it out already a promising sign? Like, if they were just completely uninterested, wouldn't they have said that they weren't? Wouldn't they have said that by now?
Yes. Well, there hasn't been a vast amount of policy clarification on a wide range of subjects yet. So who can say? It's a little ambiguous whether silence is enthusiasm or a vacuum.
Hey, we should talk about Article 6. I was under the distinct impression that we had a breakthrough win on Article 6 at the start of this COP in the opening plenary, but as it turns out, it wasn't that much of a breakthrough because we managed to have another breakthrough win.
It's all breakthroughs.
In the closing plenary.
We broke through even harder. We broke through on a whole new level, but the first breakthrough was a great breakthrough, Luke. Don't you dare minimise the achievements of the Azerbaijani presidency in catalysing the unique power of giving a thumbs up to stuff done previously by the bureaucracy. Nobody gives a thumbs up like the Azerbaijani government.
People that are excited about carbon markets seem to be mostly excited about the rules that have been agreed in that first of the two-part closing plenary, Article 6.2, which is all about bilateral carbon trading between countries. And then, of course, Article 6.4, which is about global carbon trading markets. I must admit, I have not even glanced at these texts, Tennant. Is there anything that you can tell us around what they contain, which is so exciting?
They are technical to a degree that, in many respects, baffles me. These are dealing with, among other things, the questions of the registries in which emissions reductions at associated units appear, and really, really fine-grained logistics of when they are and in what way they are adjusted in, entered and changed in these registries when they're first issued, the extent to which and the ways in which parties can authorise them and then potentially deauthorise the use of these emissions reductions, and do they have to write terms and conditions that specify an ability to revoke authorization subsequently? These are all matters that are in practice really, really important for whether a unit is going to be, whether a project to reduce emissions is going to be actually investable, or if you're going to fear that the whole thing could just be torn up on a whim. If there's a change of government in the government, the country that is hosting an emissions reduction project. The things that I would pull out of it are that Article 6, international cooperation on emissions reduction, has been under negotiation in one form or another since before 2009. Like before there was an Article 6 and a Paris Agreement, the work leading up to this has been going on a very long time. And the specific negotiations on what is now Article 6 have been 9 years, and that work is done. Like, the thing is implementable. Actual registration of projects under this and issuance of credits under the 6.4 global market mechanism will be getting underway in 2025. And the Article 6 negotiators are all going to go and do something else for a bit. Like, they're free. There's no work program for them to carry on with. They're like emerging into the outside world, blinking at the sunlight. Well, right now, as we record, they're probably in a coma, but they will emerge from that coma. And what will now happen is we will see just how much supply and just how much demand there is for international emissions units. And my strong suspicion is there's way more supply than there is demand, that there's, beyond the international airline offsetting scheme and a couple of second-tier ETSs, there's not a lot of large markets saying we are going to achieve a significant fraction of our ambition through buying units. There's a bunch who say we could do more if we could sell units, including Brazil, as we talked about last episode. And so how's that going to play out? Is it going to be as big a deal as everybody who has slaved away for 9 to 15 years on Article 6 has hoped? Or is it going to wind up being a footnote? Or at least for a while, until we need gajillions of tons of negative emissions to deal with the fact that we've blown past or shortly will have, blown past the carbon budget for 1.5.
All right. I reckon it's time for one more thing, in which we all share something which has captured our attention from the outcomes of COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan. Frankie, what have you got?
Well, I got my buildings thing in earlier, so I don't need to talk about that.
But you could.
Well, I could. I just did. Moving right along. The other item that I have to confess I wasn't following closely, but I was struck by in the closing plenary was the approval of the text on gender equality measures, because that was the first item that was dealt with in part 2 of the plenary, and there was a very prolonged round of applause at 10. I mean, you were in the room, but it felt like that was pretty broad in the space. And then quite a lot of parties wanted to make interventions after that had been gavelled through. And that was striking, not just because of the obvious kind of celebration and support for it, but also what we'd heard. Certainly the briefing that we were all lucky to sit in on towards the end of the first week from the Australian delegation, which seemed to suggest that the negotiations weren't going that well on gender. What we had heard was that there was a push for actually a bit of backsliding on this issue. And just to kind of lay it out in brief, this item is referred to as the Lima Work Program on Gender. It was established in 2014 to advance a gender-responsive approach to climate policy and climate action. In a proposed update to the text at this COP, there was a line included to recognise that different experiences that climate change could have based on gender, sex, age, and race. And apparently, a group of countries, including the Vatican, because the Holy See is a party to the COP, Egypt, Iran, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, demanded they didn't want the word gender in this reference. I think despite the fact that it's been included in previous versions of the text. So some of the reporting and chatter around this was that, the term could be construed to include transgender and gay women and, all this sort of stuff. And some of those countries that objected to it that's illegal in some of those places. So that has a really ugly kind of connotation to it from my perspective. But in the end, things sort of came good, and there was a commitment under the program to extend the work program by a further 10 years, and a mandate was given to go away and come up with a gender action plan that would be discussed and hopefully adopted at next year's COP in Brazil. A couple of the countries that had objected to that, I think, that spoke afterwards, talked about the need for resourcing, sort of,
Yes.
and all that to deal with some of the ambition around, ensuring gender parity, and some of the agencies that, also policy-making bodies that do this work within countries. So those are the kind of interventions made. But in the end, it feels like they made the best of, what could be done by securing an extension for the work, and probably good to see that we haven't backslided on gender in 2024. That's my one more thing.
It's really interesting the gender dynamics at COP itself, because there are some surprises of the countries who spoke and blocs who spoke vehemently in favour of the gender decision. Only Mexico was represented in the closing plenary by a woman, and you had a bunch of middle-aged men voicing the support for women and girls in the rest of those interventions. And then in the negotiations, so at the closing plenary, Saudi Arabia, certainly represented by a bloke, in the working negotiations, they have a bunch of brassy, kick-ass women who voice opinions and positions that I disagree with enormously, but are extremely capable and respected. And so it's COP is not the world. COP is its own unique place.
I would love to see a report on the gender split of attendees for both attendees and then delegations and then delegation heads and things like that.
Maybe some of those organisations that are churning out spurious numbers on fossil fuel advocates that are turning up to COPs could actually do something useful and turn their attention to that question.
Don't tempt me, Luke.
That'd be nice.
So, Tennant, what's your one more thing?
Well, I've got one more things. One of them extremely silly. I would first note that at the end of the main proceedings, the presidency of the COP declared that the new collective quantified goal, the mitigation work program, and what was the other element that they picked out? I'm gonna track this down. It's tremendously important that I get it right. Oh, and the global goal and adaptation. So the NCQG, the GGA, and the NWP all collectively form, he declared, the Baku Climate Unity Package, which is great. But surely somebody by now has realised that is the B Cup. And I look forward to the B Cup being filled out as the year progresses.
Oh, that's terrible.
More content. It is. It absolutely is. My real one more thing is that a dog that didn't bark in the close of it all as a point of controversy was the issue of unilateral trade measures. There were a couple of mentions in closing
I was waiting
statements.
for it.
Yeah. But this was an issue that nearly derailed the COP at the outset. It was one major part of the agenda fight at the outset. Would unilateral trade-related measures, which, dear listener, mostly means CBAM, but not exclusively, would that be put on the agenda somewhere? And in the end, it was, in a quiet and delicate way, inserted into the forward work agenda of the Forum on the Impacts of Response Measures. And over 5 years, that forum is going to have a discussion that includes the impacts of response measures, including cross-border impacts, having regard to a piece of text from the convention, which basically says don't do disguised restraints on trade in the guise of climate measures. And so there is going to be discussion of this, but they found a clever way through so as not to have just a complete blockage. And so this is a case where both no news is good news, but also I am hopeful in my heart that this discussion and others in parallel will wind up making parties more aware of the real dynamics of carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And, to know CBAM is to love CBAM. And I believe that love will be spreading through the world in the course of that work program. And that's my one more thing.
All right. So for my one more thing, I've got something for the listeners out there that are hungry for even more COP content. And frankly, how could you not be? Towards the end of week 1 of COP29, I recorded an episode of the First Fuel podcast with Australia's Assistant Energy and Climate Minister, Josh Wilson. It is obviously a point in time check-in, but there was plenty of interesting stuff in there, including his view on how all of the cross-currents in global politics and international negotiations would feed into Australia's deliberations on things like sector plans and the nationally determined contribution that we need to land on at some point in 2025. So if you are inclined to check that extra bit of pod content out, you'll find a link to the First Fuel podcast in your show notes. That's our show for today. We, of course, welcome your feedback, your insights. We're back on the report train, so if you've got a report you want us to sneak in before Christmas, you'll want to shoot that along to mailbag@letmesumup.net. This podcast was edited by energy professional and podcast tragic Mark Spencer from Here Media Studio. Frankie, how do we pay for that editing?
We pay for Mark's glorious services by extracting just a wee little contribution from some of you fabulous listeners who subscribe to our Patreon. And if you head on over to patreon.com/letmesumup, you'll find some juicy extra boko that doesn't go in the normal feed. I think most recently at a midpoint in COP, we processed, group therapied a bit on the US election result. At some point in the near to medium term future, we'll have the sequel to that bit of boko, which was us playing Dungeons and Dragons together.
That's true.
In recovery from the post-US election chat. But there's lots of other fun stuff on there. Our notes from the episodes, alternative titles that didn't make it through to the end, maybe a little something on T-shirts in the next little while. So head on over, and if you can, we really appreciate your support at patreon.com/letmesumup.
And we've been giving Mark a workout this month. We average a couple of episodes a month, I think, because of COPs and, emergency podcasts recorded in the aftermath of CBAM reports being released. I think we're going to get 4 episodes out in November. So if you did want to tip a little bit of change into the hat to help Mark do a little bit of extra editing this month, it would be greatly appreciated. But Tennant, we don't put everything behind a paywall. In fact, we put most of it not behind a paywall. Where is the not paywalled content?
It's at www.letmesumup.net, the greatest free collection of podcast content in the world. Asterisk, climate report and energy report related content. Asterisk, involving the 3 of us and sometime collaborator Alison Reeve. It's all at blendysummer.net.
Tennant, I hope you can snuggle into bed very, very soon. But while you're doing that, for Frankie Muskovich and Tennant Reed, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.